The photograph was taken at 3:47 p.m. on September 15, 1957, capturing the exact moment when 16-year-old Ruby Mae Johnson realized that education would cost her everything she had ever loved. In the image, she stands alone on the steps of Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas, her books clutched against her chest like armor, while behind her a mob of white faces twisted with hatred screams for her blood. What the photograph doesn't show is that by sunset that same day, her father would be dead. Ruby Mae had been chosen not because she was the bravest or the smartest of the black students in Little Rock, but because she was the most ordinary. The NAACP lawyers believed that an unremarkable girl from an unremarkable family would draw less attention, would slip more quietly through the cracks of a segregated system that was already beginning to crumble. They had calculated everything except the depth of white rage that would be unleashed when that ordinary girl dared to walk through doors that had been barred to her people for generations. She lived with her parents and younger brother in a 2-bedroom shotgun house on the east side of Little Rock, in a neighborhood where the streets were unpaved and the streetlights worked only when the city remembered to fix them. Her father, Samuel Johnson, worked the night shift at a lumber mill, coming home each morning with sawdust in his hair and splinters embedded so deep in his hands they looked like permanent fixtures. Her mother, Dolores, cleaned houses for white families across town, taking 3 buses each way to reach neighborhoods where she wasn't allowed to live but was expected to know intimately enough to maintain. The Johnson family had never been political. They attended Macedonia Baptist Church every Sunday, where Reverend Williams preached about patience and endurance and the rewards that awaited the faithful in the next life. Samuel had fought in World War II, believing the promises about democracy and freedom that recruiters had whispered in colored neighborhoods, but he had returned to the same segregated world he had left, only now with nightmares that made him scream in his sleep and a purple heart that meant nothing to the white shop owners who still made him enter through the back door. Ruby Mae was different from her parents in ways that both proud and terrified them. She asked questions that made adults uncomfortable, read books that challenged ideas they had accepted as unchangeable, and possessed a quiet dignity that seemed too large for someone so young. When she was 14, she had walked into the white public library downtown and asked to check out a book, knowing full well that colored people weren't allowed inside. The librarian had called the police, but Ruby Mae had stood her ground, explaining calmly that she was an American citizen and taxpayer and deserved access to books purchased with public funds that included her father's earnings. The incident had made the local colored newspaper, and somehow word had reached the NAACP lawyers who were looking for students to integrate Little Rock schools following the Supreme Court's decision in Brown v. Board of Education. They had visited the Johnson home on a humid evening in July, 2 well-dressed men who spoke in careful, measured tones about history and justice and the responsibility of ordinary people to do extraordinary things. Samuel had been against it from the beginning. He knew too much about what happened to colored people who stepped out of line, who forgot their place, who challenged the natural order that white folks believed God himself had established. He had seen men lynched for less than what his daughter was being asked to do. He had seen families driven from their homes, businesses burned to the ground, lives destroyed for the crime of wanting what white people took for granted. But Dolores had surprised everyone by supporting Ruby Mae's decision. She had spent years cleaning the homes of white families, seeing their children take for granted educational opportunities that her own daughter would never have access to. She had watched white children waste expensive textbooks while colored schools made do with outdated materials that white schools had discarded. She had bitten her tongue through countless humiliations, but the chance for her daughter to receive a real education was worth any risk. The first day of school had been planned with military precision. Federal troops had been called in to escort the 9 colored students who would integrate Central High School, and the whole world was watching as Little Rock became the battleground where America would decide whether it truly believed in equality or whether the promises of the Constitution were just words on paper. Ruby Mae had woken before dawn, pressing her best dress and polishing her shoes until they gleamed. She had eaten breakfast with her family in unusual silence, everyone understanding that this meal might be their last together as they had always been. Samuel had kissed her forehead and told her he was proud of her, even though fear radiated from every pore of his body. Dolores had packed her lunch with extra care, as if the perfect sandwich could somehow protect her daughter from the hatred she was about to face. The federal troops had escorted Ruby May and the other 8 students to the school steps, where they were met by a crowd that had grown throughout the morning like a cancer, fed by rumors and rage and the kind of mob mentality that had always lurked just beneath the surface of Southern civilization. The students walked through a gauntlet of screaming faces, past signs that compared them to animals, past threats of violence so specific and graphic that even hardened soldiers looked uncomfortable. Inside the school, the hatred was more subtle but no less toxic. White students emptied the hallways when Ruby May approached, as if her very presence was contaminating. Teachers spoke to her only when absolutely necessary, their voices cold and clipped. Her locker was vandalized daily with slurs and threats, and food was regularly thrown at her in the cafeteria, though she continued to sit alone and eat her lunch with quiet dignity. But it was the isolation that nearly broke her. She had expected the hatred from strangers, but she hadn't anticipated how lonely it would be to spend her days surrounded by hundreds of people who treated her as if she didn't exist. She ate lunch by herself, walked the halls alone, and sat in classrooms where she was the only person who looked like her, the only person who understood what it meant to carry the weight of an entire race's hopes and fears. The breaking point came 3 weeks into the school year. Ruby May had been walking home from school, flanked by federal marshals who maintained a careful distance, when a group of white teenagers began following them. The group grew larger as it moved through the neighborhoods, picking up angry adults and curious children who wanted to see the colored girl who thought she was good enough for their school. By the time Ruby May reached her own neighborhood, the crowd had swollen to nearly 100 people. They surrounded her house, chanting slurs and threats, demanding that the Johnson family leave town immediately. Samuel had been sleeping after his night shift when the noise woke him, and he had emerged from the house to find his front yard filled with hostile white faces. He had tried to reason with them, speaking in the careful, deferential tone that colored men had perfected as a survival mechanism. He explained that his daughter was just trying to get an education, that they meant no harm to anyone, that they just wanted to live peacefully and raise their children to be good Americans. The crowd had grown angrier at his words, interpreting his calm demeanor as arrogance, his articulate speech as proof that he thought he was better than they were. Someone threw a rock that struck Samuel in the forehead, opening a gash that bled down his face. Someone else shouted that uppity coloreds needed to be taught a lesson they would never forget. The federal marshals had tried to disperse the crowd, but they were outnumbered and operating under strict orders not to use excessive force. Local police had arrived but seemed more interested in controlling the federal agents than protecting the Johnson family. The crowd sensed the power vacuum and grew bolder, pressing closer to the house, their chants becoming more violent and specific. Samuel had made a decision that would haunt his family forever. Seeing his wife and son cowering inside the house, watching his daughter stand frozen on the porch as grown adults screamed for her death, he had stepped forward and raised his voice above the chaos. He had told them that if they wanted to hurt someone, they should hurt him. He was the one who had allowed his daughter to go to their school. He was the one who had forgotten his place. His family was innocent, and if the crowd needed to teach someone a lesson, he was ready to learn it. The crowd had gone silent for a moment, surprised by his offer. Then someone had laughed, a sound like breaking glass, and said that they would be happy to educate him about the consequences of raising uppity children. They had dragged Samuel from his front yard as his family watched in horror. Ruby May had tried to follow, but the federal marshals had held her back, explaining that there was nothing they could do, that their orders were to protect the students, not their families. She had screamed for her father as the crowd disappeared around the corner, taking him to a fate that everyone understood but no one would speak aloud. They found Samuel's body the next morning in Gillum Park, hanging from an oak tree that had been used for the same purpose dozens of times before. He had been beaten so severely that he was barely recognizable, his purple heart ripped from his chest and shoved into his mouth. Pinned to his shirt was a note that read, "This is what happens to coloreds who don't know their place." The local newspaper reported his death as a suicide, claiming that Samuel Johnson had been overcome with shame about his daughter's behavior and had taken his own life rather than face the consequences of her actions. No investigation was conducted. No arrests were made. The federal agents who had witnessed his abduction claimed they had seen nothing that would justify intervention. Ruby May never returned to Central High School. She couldn't bring herself to walk through those doors knowing that her education had cost her father's life, that her dream of equality had become his nightmare. She spent the funeral receiving condolences from people who told her that her father had died for a noble cause, that his sacrifice would not be forgotten, that she should be proud of the role she had played in advancing civil rights. But pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. Pride had killed her father as surely as the rope around his neck. The Johnson family left Little Rock 3 days after the funeral, moving north to Chicago where Dolores had a sister who could help them start over. They changed their name to Jackson and tried to disappear into the anonymity of urban life, but Ruby May carried her father's death like a stone in her chest, a weight that grew heavier with each passing year. She never finished high school. She married young, to a man who didn't know her real name or her history, and raised 3 children in a small apartment on the south side of Chicago. She worked as a seamstress, her fingers moving automatically through familiar motions while her mind replayed that last morning with her father, wondering what would have happened if she had chosen safety over education, if she had been content with the colored school where she belonged. Her children grew up knowing nothing about their grandfather's sacrifice or their mother's role in the integration of Central High School. Ruby May had buried that part of her life so deep that sometimes she could almost convince herself it had happened to someone else, that the girl in the famous photograph was a stranger who shared her face but not her pain. It wasn't until 1987, 30 years after her father's death, that Ruby May learned the full truth about what had happened that day. A reporter working on a book about the Little Rock Nine had tracked her down, wanting to interview her about her experiences as one of the forgotten students who had tried to integrate the school. The reporter had done extensive research, interviewing federal agents who had finally retired and were willing to speak about events they had witnessed but been ordered to ignore. He had uncovered documents that had been classified for decades, reports that detailed the systematic intimidation and violence used to drive colored families from Little Rock after the integration attempt. What Ruby May learned changed everything she thought she knew about her father's death. Samuel Johnson had not been killed randomly by an angry mob. He had been specifically targeted by a group of white businessmen and city officials who had decided that the integration of Central High School needed to be stopped by any means necessary. They had identified the families of the 9 students and had developed a systematic campaign of terror designed to force them to withdraw their children from the school. Samuel had been chosen as an example because he was a war veteran whose death would send a clear message that even military service would not protect colored people who stepped out of line. The mob that had surrounded the Johnson house had been carefully organized and directed by men who had never soiled their own hands with violence but who understood its power as a tool of social control. The federal agents who had witnessed Samuel's abduction had been ordered by their superiors not to intervene, because protecting the integration students was considered more important than protecting their families. The government had made a calculated decision that some colored lives were expendable in service of the greater goal of desegregation. Most devastating of all, Ruby May learned that her father's death had been completely unnecessary. The white power structure in Little Rock had already decided to close Central High School rather than allow integration to continue. Samuel had died for a cause that had already been abandoned by the very people who had asked his daughter to risk everything for it. The reporter asked Ruby May if she wanted to go public with this information, if she wanted to tell the world what had really happened to her father and how the government had betrayed the families of the Little Rock Nine. He promised that her story would be front-page news, that justice could finally be served, that her father's sacrifice would be properly honored. Ruby May had listened to his proposal in silence, thinking about the life she had built in Chicago, about her children who knew nothing of their history, about the peace she had found in anonymity. Then she had asked him to leave and never contact her again. She never told anyone what she had learned about her father's death. She carried the knowledge like she carried everything else, quietly and alone, understanding that some truths are too dangerous to speak aloud. Ruby May died in 2019 at the age of 78, taking her secrets with her to the grave. Her obituary listed her as a retired seamstress who was survived by 3 children and 7 grandchildren. There was no mention of Central High School or her father's sacrifice or her role in one of the most important moments in American civil rights history. But the photograph remains, archived in libraries and museums across the country, showing a 16-year-old girl standing alone on school steps while hatred swirls around her like smoke. Most people who see it assume they're looking at one of the famous Little Rock Nine, unaware that they're seeing a girl whose story was too dangerous to tell, whose sacrifice was too complete to acknowledge. The truth about Ruby Mae Johnson is that she integrated Central High School for exactly 3 weeks before her father's murder forced her to choose between education and survival. She chose survival, but it came at a cost that no 16-year-old should have to pay. Her story raises questions that America has never fully answered. How many other families paid the ultimate price for integration? How many other fathers died so their children could attend white schools? How many other Ruby Mays chose silence over justice, anonymity over acknowledgement, survival over truth? The civil rights movement is often remembered as a triumph of justice over hatred, a story of brave individuals who faced down the forces of racism and emerged victorious. But Ruby Mae's story reminds us that victory came with a price that was measured in blood and tears and broken families, that progress was built on foundations of sacrifice that we have chosen to forget. She spent 62 years carrying her father's death like a weight in her chest, wondering if his sacrifice had meant anything, if the world was any better because of what they had endured. She never lived to see Barack Obama become president or to witness the ongoing struggle for racial justice that continues to this day. But maybe that's not the point. Maybe the point is that Ruby Mae Johnson loved her father enough to carry his memory in silence, that she was strong enough to survive the destruction of everything she had believed about justice and equality, that she found a way to build a life from the ashes of her dreams. The photograph of Ruby Mae on the steps of Central High School is more than just a historical document. It's a reminder that behind every moment of progress, behind every victory in the long struggle for equality, there are ordinary people who paid extraordinary prices for changes they might never live to see. The girl in the photograph thought she was walking toward education and opportunity. Instead, she was walking toward a truth that would shatter her family and change her life forever. She thought courage meant facing down hatred and claiming her rights as an American citizen. She learned that sometimes courage means carrying unbearable knowledge in silence, building a life from broken pieces, and finding peace in anonymity. Ruby Mae Johnson never became famous. She never gave speeches or wrote books or had schools named after her. But she did something perhaps more important: she survived. She carried her father's sacrifice forward into a future he never got to see, and she raised children who grew up free from the knowledge that their grandfather had died for their right to learn. In the end, maybe that's what heroism really looks like. Not the grand gestures that make headlines, but the quiet courage to keep living when everything you believed has been proven false, to find hope when hope seems impossible, to choose life when death would be easier. The photograph shows a moment in time, but Ruby Mae Johnson lived a lifetime in its shadow, carrying secrets too heavy for any one person to bear, building meaning from meaninglessness, finding light in the deepest darkness imaginable.